The crystal chandeliers of Whitmore Hall cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as Eleanor Clark stood frozen at the ballroom entrance. Every eye in London's most exclusive gathering turned toward her, and the music seemed to falter for just a moment. Then came the whispers, sharp as broken glass, cutting through the air with surgical precision. They thought she couldn't hear them, but she heard every word. The seamstress's daughter, who dared to enter their world. The girl in the borrowed dress who thought she belonged among diamonds and silk. But before you close this video, let me tell you what happened next, because when the most powerful man in England crossed that ballroom floor toward her, everything changed. And if you've ever felt like you don't belong, like the world is laughing at your dreams, you need to hear this story. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to share will show you that sometimes the very thing that makes you different is what makes you extraordinary. The autumn of 1852 had painted London in shades of gold and amber, but for Eleanor Clark, the world had always been colored in the practical hues of thread and fabric. Her fingers, calloused from years of needlework in her mother's modest shop on Grassetchit Street, trembled as she clutched the invitation that should never have been hers. Lady Pemberton, grateful for the miraculous restoration of her daughter's wedding gown after a terrible accident, had insisted Eleanor attend the harvest ball as her personal guest. It was kindness, perhaps, or maybe just the whim of a wealthy woman who enjoyed shocking society. Either way, Eleanor found herself standing at the threshold of a world she had only glimpsed through shop windows and servants' gossip. The dress she wore was her masterpiece, created from remnants of the finest fabrics that had passed through their shop, pieces too small for the wealthy clients, but perfect for someone who knew how to see potential where others saw waste. Midnight blue silk cascaded like water, adorned with silver embroidery that had taken her 3 months of late nights to complete. She had poured her dreams into every stitch, creating something that rivaled the gowns of the aristocracy, yet marked her immediately as an outsider to those who knew quality from birthright. As she entered the ballroom, the laughter started as a ripple and grew into a wave. Lady Ashford, draped in pearls that could have fed Eleanor's family for a year, whispered behind her fan to her companions. Lord Pemberton's nephew openly pointed, his face twisted in amusement. The debutantes, fresh-faced and cruel in their privilege, giggled behind gloved hands. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin, remembering her mother's words. "Stand tall, my dear. Grace costs nothing, but is worth everything." The orchestra played a waltz, couples swirling across the floor in perfect synchronization, a dance Eleanor had learned by watching through windows and practicing alone in her tiny room above the shop. She moved toward the edge of the room, hoping to find Lady Pemberton and perhaps a quiet corner where she could spend the evening unnoticed. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A hush fell over the ballroom like a velvet curtain. The Duke of Ravenswood had arrived. Sebastian Thornbury, the 5th Duke of Ravenswood, was not merely wealthy or titled. He was power incarnate. At 32, he controlled more land than some small countries, influenced Parliament with a word, and had turned down marriage proposals from every eligible lady in Europe. Tall and dark-haired, with eyes the color of winter storms, he moved through society like a lion among sheep, acknowledged, feared, and utterly untouchable. He had been abroad for 2 years, and his unexpected return to London had set every marriage-minded mother into a frenzy. But tonight, something stopped him at the ballroom entrance. Perhaps it was the way the light caught the silver threads in her gown, or how she stood with quiet dignity while society's vultures circled. Or maybe it was simply that Sebastian Thornbury had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, and here was a woman who looked like she wanted nothing more than to disappear. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Eleanor felt the breath leave her lungs as those storm-gray eyes held hers. The Duke stood perfectly still for a moment that stretched like eternity, then began walking directly toward her. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, whispers rising in his wake. Every unmarried lady in the room watched in horror and fascination as the most eligible bachelor in England approached the unknown girl in the handmade gown. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as he stopped before her. Up close, He was even more intimidating, not just handsome, but possessed of a presence that made the air around him electric. When he bowed, it was with the same respect he would show a princess. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said, his voice deep and cultured, carrying a hint of amusement. "Sebastian Thornberry, at your service." Eleanor's training in the shop, where she had learned to speak properly to serve her betters, serve her now. She curtsied with practiced grace. "Eleanor Clark, your grace." "Miss Clark." He said her name as if tasting fine wine. "Would you honor me with this dance?" The gasps were audible. Lady Ashford's fan stopped mid-flutter. Lord Pemberton's nephew nearly dropped a champagne. The Duke of Ravenswood, who had not danced publicly in 2 years, who had rejected the advances of duchesses and princesses, was asking the seamstress's daughter to dance. Eleanor knew she should refuse, knew that accepting would only fuel the mockery, would make her a target for every jealous lady in London. But something in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of one outsider to another, made her place her hand in his. "I would be honored, your grace." The moment their hands touched, Eleanor felt it, a connection that transcended silk gloves and social stations. Sebastian led her onto the dance floor, and the orchestra, recovering from their shock, began a new waltz. The first steps were terrifying. Every eye in the ballroom watched them, waiting for her to stumble, to prove she didn't belong. But Sebastian's hand at her waist was steady, his lead clear and strong. "Breathe," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "And trust me." And she did. As they moved together, the room began to fade. There was only the music, the warmth of his hand, and the surprising grace of their movement together. Eleanor had learned to waltz from stolen moments and secret observations, but in Sebastian's arms, she truly danced. He guided her through complex turns with effortless skill, making her look like she had been born to this. "You dance beautifully," he said, and there was genuine surprise in his voice. "I had an excellent teacher," Eleanor replied, thinking of the elderly dance master who had given her lessons in exchange for mending his coats. "I suspect," Sebastian said, spinning her elegantly, "that you have many hidden talents, Miss Clark." As they danced, he asked her questions, not the empty pleasantries of society, but real questions about her work, her dreams, her thoughts on the new industrial age transforming London. Eleanor found herself answering honestly, forgetting to be nervous, forgetting the watching crowd. Sebastian listened with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the room. "You made this gown yourself," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor's chin lifted slightly. "Yes. It's extraordinary. The embroidery alone must have taken months." She stared at him, surprised. Most men wouldn't notice such things. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I'm not most men, Miss Clark. Just as you, I suspect, are not most women." The dance ended too soon. Sebastian bowed over her hand, holding it perhaps a moment longer than propriety demanded. "Would you take a turn about the garden with me? I find the air in here rather stifling." Eleanor knew she should refuse, knew that leaving with him would cement her reputation as a fortune hunter, a social climber. But the thought of returning to the edge of the room, to the whispers and the laughter, made her nod. "I would like that, your grace." If the ballroom had been shocked before, it was nothing compared to the scandal of the Duke of Ravenswood escorting the unknown Miss Clark to the garden. Lady Ashford looked ready to faint. Young Lord Pemberton's face turned an alarming shade of purple, but Sebastian seemed oblivious to it all, offering Eleanor his arm as if she were royalty. The garden was a paradise of moonlight and roses, the October air crisp but not cold. Paper lanterns hung from the trees, casting a soft glow over winding paths and marble fountains. Sebastian led her to a stone bench beneath an ancient oak, far enough from the ballroom that the music was just a distant melody. "Now," he said, settling beside her with a comfortable lack of ceremony, "tell me the truth. How does the daughter of a seamstress come to dance like a duchess?" Eleanor considered lying, spinning some tale that might make her more acceptable. But something about him, perhaps the way he had said seamstress, without a trace of disdain, made her honest. When you spend your life creating beauty for others, you learn to find it wherever you can, she said. I watch. I learn. I practice in secret. Dance, languages, etiquette, I absorb it all, not because I want to be something I'm not, but because knowledge is the one thing they can't take away from you. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, studying her in the moonlight. You're quite remarkable, you know. Because I can imitate my betters?
No. His voice was serious now.
Because you don't see them as your betters at all. You see them as they are, people in expensive clothes, no more or less human than you. Eleanor looked at him sharply. That's a dangerous observation, Your Grace. The truth often is. He leaned back, gazing up at the stars. Do you know why I left England 2 years ago? The papers said you were touring your foreign investments. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The papers say many things. The truth is, I left because I couldn't bear another moment of the charade. Every conversation calculated, every friendship transactional, every woman who smiled at me seeing only a title and a fortune. I thought distance would bring clarity. Instead, it only brought loneliness. Eleanor understood loneliness. It was the price of standing between worlds, too refined for her own class, too common for the one she served. And did you find what you were looking for? I thought not. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were intense in the lantern light. Until tonight. Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, a commotion arose from the ballroom. Lady Ashford appeared at the garden entrance, her face a mask of righteous indignation, followed by a small crowd of society's elite. Your Grace, she called, her voice carrying the authority of generations of breeding. We were concerned for your welfare. One can't be too careful about unsuitable company. The insult was as clear as a slap. Eleanor started to rise, ready to flee, but Sebastian's hand on her stopped her. He stood slowly, his transformation remarkable. The thoughtful man who had spoken of loneliness vanished, replaced by every inch the Duke. Cold, aristocratic, and utterly forbidding. Lady Ashford. His voice could have frozen flame. How kind of you to concern yourself with my welfare. However, I find Miss Clark's company entirely suitable. In fact, I find it preferable to present company. The lady's face went white, then red. Your Grace, surely you don't mean, this person is careful. The single word cracked like a whip. Miss Clark is my particular guest this evening. Any insult to her is an insult to me, and I have an excellent memory for insults. The threat was politely veiled but unmistakable. The Duke of Ravenswood's power was not merely social. He held the mortgages on half of Mayfair, controlled votes in Parliament, and could destroy reputations with a word. Lady Ashford, for all her pride, was not foolish enough to challenge him directly. Of course, Your Grace, she managed, though the words seemed to choke her. I merely thought. The difficulty, Lady Ashford, is that you didn't think at all. He turned to Eleanor, his manner softening instantly. Miss Clark, would you care to return to the ballroom? I believe the next dance is mine as well. Eleanor rose, her mind whirling. She should run. Should escape before this became worse. But Sebastian's eyes held a challenge and a promise, and she found herself taking his offered arm. The return to the ballroom was like entering a gladiatorial arena. Every eye followed them, conversations stopping mid-sentence. Sebastian led her directly to the dance floor, ignoring the subtle attempts of several prominent ladies to catch his attention. As the music began, another waltz, he drew her into his arms with a possessiveness that set tongues wagging. You're destroying your reputation, Eleanor whispered as they began to move. On the contrary, he replied, guiding her through a complex turn. I'm finally creating one worth having. They'll make your life miserable. They've been doing that for years. The difference is, now I have a reason to endure it. Eleanor's step faltered. Your Grace. Sebastian, he corrected. And before you construct all the reasons why this is impossible, let me tell you what I see when I look at you. His voice was low, meant only for her. I see a woman who creates beauty from scraps, who learns in secret what others take for granted, who faces a room full of mockery with more true nobility than any titled lady here. I see someone who looks at me and sees not a duke, but a man. Do you have any idea how rare that is? You don't know me, Eleanor protested, even as her heart raced. One dance, one conversation. I know enough. He spun her elegantly, drawing her closer than strictly proper. I know you could have used Lady Pemberton's invitation to try to catch a wealthy husband, but instead you came simply to experience beauty. I know you spent months creating that gown not to impress society, but to satisfy your own vision of perfection. I know you have courage enough to dance with the Duke while the entire room watches and judges. What more do I need to know? The dance ended, but Sebastian didn't release her immediately. Have dinner with me tomorrow, he said. It wasn't quite a request. That's impossible. The scandal. I've spent my entire life avoiding scandal. It's exhausting and ultimately pointless. His thumb traced a small circle on her gloved hand. Besides, what's the point of being a duke if you can't cause a little social upheaval? Despite everything, Eleanor found herself smiling. You're quite impossible, you know. So I've been told, usually by people who are about to give me exactly what I want. His answering smile was boyish, transforming his austere features. Say yes, Eleanor. The use of her first name, here in the middle of the ballroom, was shocking, thrilling, dangerous. Yes, she heard herself say. What happened next would be recounted in drawing rooms across London for months. The Duke of Ravenswood not only monopolized the nobody seamstress for the rest of the evening, he was seen laughing, actually laughing, at something she said. He brought her refreshments himself, introduced her to the Prime Minister as the remarkably talented Miss Clark, and when Lady Ashford made another cutting remark within his hearing, he very publicly cut her dead, turning his back on her mid-sentence. By the end of the evening, Eleanor Clark was the most talked-about woman in London. The next months passed in a whirlwind that Eleanor could hardly believe was real. Sebastian courted her openly, scandalously, brilliantly. He arrived at her mother's shop in his finest carriage, causing traffic to stop on Grassetich Street. He commissioned gowns from them, insisting on paying triple the asking price. He took Eleanor to the opera, to museums, to garden parties where his presence forced society to receive her, however grudgingly. But it was the private moments that captured her heart. The afternoons in his library, where they read poetry aloud and debated philosophy. The quiet dinners where he told her about his travels, his dreams of using his wealth for reform and progress. The way he looked at her, not as a conquest or a curiosity, but as an equal, a partner, a missing piece of himself. They're saying I've bewitched you, Eleanor told him one evening as they walked through Hyde Park, trailed at a discreet distance by her mother as chaperone. Perhaps you have, Sebastian replied. How else can I explain the fact that I, who swore never to marry, am about to make you an offer? Eleanor stopped walking. Sebastian, don't. Please. He turned to face her, taking both her hands. Why not? Because fairy tales aren't real. Because dukes don't marry seamstresses. Because one day you'll wake up and realize what you've sacrificed for a moment's infatuation. Stop. His voice was firm. Do you love me? The question, so direct, stole her breath. That's not the point. It's the only point. Do you love me, Eleanor? She looked into his storm-gray eyes and couldn't lie. Yes. Then marry me. He dropped to one knee right there in the park, causing her mother to gasp and several passers-by to stop and stare. Not because I'm a duke, not because it's a fairy tale, but because I love you desperately and can't imagine a life without you in it. The scandal will pass. They always do. Your family will come around or lose me forever. Their choice. Society will never accept me. Then we'll make our own society. He pulled out a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the late afternoon light. Eleanor Clark, you entered my world uninvited and turned it upside down. You showed me that there's more to life than titles and tradition. You made me want to be better than I was. Will you marry me? Through tears she hadn't realized were falling, Eleanor saw the truth in his eyes. This wasn't a duke making a rebellious gesture. This was a man offering his heart. Yes, she whispered. The wedding was the scandal of the decade. Half of society refused to attend, but the half that did filled St. George's Church to overflowing. Lady Pemberton stood as Eleanor's matron of honor, declaring loudly that she had known from the start that Miss Clark was destined for greatness. The Prime Minister himself gave a reading, and when Eleanor walked down the aisle in a gown of her own creation, ivory silk embroidered with gold thread and a pattern of climbing roses, even her harshest critics had to admit she looked every inch a duchess. Sebastian's eyes never left her face as she approached. When the Archbishop asked if anyone objected, the silence was deafening. Lady Ashford, who had attempted one last campaign to stop the wedding, was notably absent, having been informed by her husband that crossing the Duke of Ravenswood was financial suicide. "You may kiss the bride," the Archbishop pronounced, and Sebastian did so with an enthusiasm that had the more conservative members of the congregation fanning themselves. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Eleanor caught sight of familiar faces in the crowd. The elderly dance master who had taught her to waltz, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The French tutor who had given her lessons in exchange for mending. The shopgirls from Bond Street who had shared their observations of fine manners. All the people who had helped her become who she was, invited at her insistence despite Sebastian's secretary's protests. "No regrets," Sebastian murmured as they emerged into the sunshine. "None," Eleanor replied and meant it. Their marriage became the stuff of legend. The Duchess of Ravenswood, as Eleanor was now known, used her position to champion causes others ignored. She established a school for working-class girls, teaching them not just practical skills but arts and graces. She convinced Sebastian to use his parliamentary influence to pass labor reforms. She hosted salons where artists and aristocrats, writers and workers mingled freely, creating a new kind of society based on merit rather than birth. And she never forgot where she came from. The shop on Gracechurch Street became the most fashionable modiste in London, with a waiting list that included royalty. Eleanor's mother, now dressed in silk and lace, presided over an empire built on her daughter's designs and her own sharp business sense. As for those who had laughed that night at the harvest ball, Lady Ashford found herself quietly excluded from the best gatherings, her influence waning as Eleanor's rose. Lord Pemberton's nephew, who had pointed and mocked, came to Sebastian hat in hand when his gambling debts threatened ruin, and found the Duke surprisingly merciful, though the price was public apology to the Duchess. One by one, society learned that accepting Eleanor meant keeping Sebastian's favor, and rejection meant social and financial exile. But the true victory came 5 years later, at another harvest ball at Whitmore Hall. Eleanor entered on Sebastian's arm, wearing a gown of midnight blue, an intentional echo of that first night, but this time adorned with the Ravenswood diamonds. The room fell silent, but now the hush was one of respect, not mockery. Young debutantes curtsied deeply. Matrons who had once whispered behind fans now vied for her attention. "Remember," Sebastian murmured in her ear, when they laughed. "I remember," Eleanor replied, smiling at Lady Pemberton, who beamed back proudly. And now, Eleanor looked around the room, at the faces that had once shown such scorn, now reflecting admiration and perhaps a little fear. But more importantly, she saw the changes. The young woman in the corner, clearly of humble origins, being treated with courtesy because the Duchess had made it fashionable to value talent over birth. The scholarship students from her school, invited as her special guests, dancing with lords and ladies who 5 years ago wouldn't have acknowledged their existence. "Now," she said, "I understand that the laughter never mattered. What mattered was having the courage to walk through that door." Sebastian raised her hand to his lips. "And the wisdom to take my hand when I offered it." "That too," she agreed, laughing. As they took their place for the first dance, Eleanor thought about that frightened girl in the borrowed dress who had stood at these very doors 5 years ago. She had thought she was entering a ballroom, but really, she had been entering her destiny. The laughter had been painful, yes, but it had also been the catalyst that brought Sebastian to her side. Sometimes, she realized, the very thing that seems like your greatest humiliation becomes your greatest triumph. The seamstress's daughter had become a duchess, but more than that, she had become herself. fully, proudly, unapologetically. The music began, and as Sebastian swept her into the dance, Eleanor caught sight of a young woman hovering at the edge of the ballroom. Her dress was clearly homemade, her gloves mended, her eyes wide with fear and determination. Eleanor recognized that look. It was the same one she had worn 5 years ago. After this dance, she murmured to Sebastian, I believe I'll introduce myself to that young lady by the pillar. Sebastian followed her gaze and smiled. Another seamstress's daughter? A baker's, I believe. Lady Morrison mentioned her. Apparently, she's here on scholarship to the academy. And you're going to make sure society receives her properly? I'm going to make sure she knows that laughter is just noise, Eleanor said, and that sometimes the Duke takes your hand first. As they danced, Eleanor made eye contact with the girl and smiled encouragingly. The girl's face lit up with hope, and Eleanor remembered why she had fought so hard to keep her place in this world. Not for the gowns or the jewels or even the title, but for the chance to hold the door open for others. The laughter that had once threatened to break her had instead forged her into something stronger. And now, as the Duchess of Ravenswood, she could ensure that other girls with dreams bigger than their circumstances would find not mockery, but mentorship, not closed doors, but open arms. The orchestra played on, couples swirled across the floor, and Eleanor Clark, seamstress's daughter, Duchess, and proof that courage matters more than birthright, danced in the arms of the man who had seen her worth when the world saw only her station. She had entered in fear and found love. She had faced laughter and earned respect. She had risked everything and gained more than she had ever dared to dream. And that, she thought as Sebastian spun her through another turn, was the real fairy tale. Not that a duke had chosen her, but that she had chosen to walk through those doors despite her fear. The laughter had been the price of admission to a life she had never imagined possible. As the evening progressed, Eleanor made good on her intention. She approached the young baker's daughter, introduced herself, and personally escorted her onto the dance floor, introducing her to appropriate partners and ensuring she was included in conversations. By the end of the night, the girl was glowing with confidence, having discovered that the Duchess herself had once stood in her shoes. Your Grace, the girl said as the evening drew to a close. Might I ask you something? Of course, Miss Hartwell. Were you very frightened? That first night, Eleanor smiled, remembering. Terrified. But I learned something important that night. Fear is just another word for excitement wearing a disguise. The question is never whether you're afraid. It's whether you'll let that fear stop you from walking through the door. Years later, when Miss Hartwell became Lady Hartwell, married to a viscount who fell in love with her brilliant mind and kind heart, she would tell the story of how the Duchess of Ravenswood had changed her life with those words. And she, in turn, would help other young women find their courage. But that was still to come. For now, Eleanor stood with Sebastian on the terrace of Whitmore Hall, looking out over the moonlit gardens where their love had truly begun. Do you ever wonder, Sebastian asked, what would have happened if I hadn't asked you to dance that night? You would have found another way, Eleanor said confidently. You were looking for something real in a world of artifice. And you were being yourself in a world that demanded you be someone else, he finished. We were inevitable, my love. Even with all the laughter? Especially with all the laughter. He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. It made our victory all the sweeter. Inside, the ball continued, but out here in their private world, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From seamstress to duchess was a transformation that society could see and measure. But the real transformation had been internal, learning that her worth was not determined by others' opinions, that courage was not the absence of fear but action in spite of it, and that love could indeed conquer all, but only when coupled with determination and self-belief. I love you, she said, the words as true now as they had been in Hyde Park all those years ago. And I love you, Sebastian replied. My brilliant, brave, beautiful Duchess who is always a queen, even when the world couldn't see it. The clock struck midnight, and somewhere in London, another girl with dreams too big for her circumstances was planning how she might change her life. Perhaps she too would face laughter. Perhaps she too would find love. But certainly, she would find inspiration in the story of the seamstress's daughter who walked into a ballroom full of mockery and emerged a duchess full of purpose. For that is the truth that Eleanor Clark learned and lived. They may laugh when you enter the room, but if you have the courage to stay, to be yourself, to believe in your own worth, you might just find that the Duke takes your hand first. And even if he doesn't, even if no Duke appears, the very act of walking through that door changes you. It declares to the world and to yourself that you refuse to be limited by others' expectations. The laughter fades. It always does. But courage? Courage echoes through generations. And so, dear viewer, if you've ever stood at the threshold of your dreams, hearing the whispers of those who think you don't belong, remember Eleanor's story. Remember that every palace was once entered by someone for the first time. Every duchess was once simply a woman with a dream. Every triumph began with the decision to try despite the fear. Don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories of courage and transformation. And tell me in the comments below, what door are you afraid to walk through? What dream seems too grand for someone of your station? Because if a seamstress's daughter can become a duchess, if love can conquer prejudice, if courage can transform mockery into admiration, then perhaps your impossible dream is just waiting for you to take the first step. The ball is always beginning somewhere. The question is, will you dare to enter? And remember, sometimes the very thing that makes you different, that makes others laugh, is exactly what will make you extraordinary. Your humble origins aren't a weakness to hide, but a strength to celebrate. Your dreams aren't too big. Perhaps your stage has simply been too small. So adjust your crown, dear dreamer. Straighten your shoulders and walk through that door. The Duke is waiting. Controls do chat Opus 4.